Hello, welcome to Blogging Heads. I'm Bill Black. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Rice University, live in the Memphis area, and I've written for The Atlantic and Vox and the Washington Post, and I specialize in the history of 19th century American religion and culture. Today I'm talking to Kate Lister. Kate, could you introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, I'd love to. I'm Kate Lister, as you said. I'm a doctor, a historian. I specialise in the study of sexuality, gender, with a particular emphasis on the history and literature around sex work and sex workers.
Where did you get your PhD?
From the University of Leeds. I've kind of stayed around the Yorkshire area of Britain, just deliberately educating myself out of any useful employment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, University.
Is that where you're from?
No. Originally, I'm from further north. I'm from right up as far north almost as you can go before you get to Scotland, Cumbria. So where the wildlings are from.
Oh. Well, and I having you on today. I think if people are familiar with you, it's perhaps because of the website Whores of Yore that you run, as well as a Twitter account.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe Whores of Yore to someone who hasn't seen it before?
Gently, I think. I was looking for a sort of it's just a way of kind of like how do you even describe it? It started off with the Twitter feed because I was really interested in using social media to try and sort of get aspects of my research out there, and I always laugh at the research quite a lot, and I find a lot of humor in it. So I thought that, well, if I'm laughing at it and if I think it's interesting, other people must do too. So it started me thinking I was being really clever and witty, rhymed whores with your. I was a comedy genius. And the Twitter feed started with it's a feed about the history of sexuality and illicit sex, which is where the whore comes from, and sex workers. So it started there, and it's grown, and the website is built out of that. But the website is a much wider platform. So I write my articles and kind of showcase and give little snippets of research that I'm doing at the moment, but I write it in a different way. But I also invite academics, artists, activists, sex workers, anyone in the sex industry to submit articles and pieces and anything that they want to say about the subject. So we've got all kinds of different voices all joining up together to talk about sex and sexuality, as well as some vintage erotica and sort of archiving images and things like that too. So yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, I would say if you think, oh well, I don't know if I just want to look at old smutty photographs. Though honestly, I don't know who doesn't. But the site has a whole lot to offer. It's really kind of a diverse, interesting project.
Oh, you learn something too.
Yeah. How did it go from the Twitter account to the website? How did you make that leap?
I made a lot of it's very responsive. It's me responding to people on Twitter. I'd love to say that it was a really well thought out and timed and executed project, but that's not true. The truth is that I respond very quickly to people and things, and it just seemed like everyone was very interested in it. And the more I used Twitter, the more I was engaging with not only with academics and historians, but with sex workers all around the world who had a lot of things to say, and I was absolutely fascinated by their voice. And it struck me that historians, especially historians who write about the history of sex work, often have no contact whatsoever with sex workers today, and they aren't. They have no links to the sex worker rights movements, and I didn't either until I started the project. And I started to see that's, and then I suddenly felt that's really wrong. Like, why am I writing about the history of a group of people with no awareness about the rights of those people today? Yeah. So I started building the website because I wanted somewhere to put the images of vintage erotica, and I wanted to be able to expand on the things there. And I think that Twitter kicked me off for like 24 hours or something. I got banned, and it suddenly.
So you wanted somewhere to be permanent.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I sort of realized it's not my sandpit, right? It's theirs. So at any point they can kick me off, and it was something I was really excited about, and I wanted to grow it. So that's that's just where it came from. There seemed to be a demand for it.
Yeah, it's interesting if you go to the About page, one of the very first sentences is, it might surprise someone just reading it for the first time. The project aims to give voice to the voiceless. And you very much have an activist impulse driving this digital scholarship. I wonder, how has your contact with sex workers and increased engagement in issues related to sex work, how has that shaped you, as a scholar?
Oh, it's completely changed how I'm a scholar. It's made me a bit embarrassed about how I used to write, which was having very little contact or awareness of sex worker rights movements today. It made me very aware of how powerful history is. And what did it was the Twitter feed started up, and I started getting messages from people in the sex industry, and whereas I thought that it was really funny, calling it Whores of Yore and tweeting all these funny things, I started to get messages from people saying thank you so much for sharing this history. It's really important to us. And that's when I suddenly dawned on me is that it's not actually funny. It's history is a hugely important thing because it gives a heritage and a legacy to a group of people, and sex workers are marginalized people. And they often don't have a voice. It's often assumed by well-meaning academics or politicians or moralists, because of the very nature of sex work. Many people are anonymous, and via their anonymity, they don't speak out. But social media offers them a platform to do that. So constantly having this very present and very real voice feeding back to me about how research was affecting them, it's changed completely how I do research. And now I'm actually writing an article about how historians write about sex work, the language that they use, and the kind of are they writing from a stigmatized position without realizing it, and how does it affect issues today if they do?
How does it? What would be an example of?
Example would be, let's take for example, sex worker rights movements. Many of them, not all, but many of them, campaign very hard to not use the word prostitute, right? If I was to say to you, like what images come to mind if I say the word prostitute to you?
Right, I think of someone on a street corner, on a sidewalk. Yeah.
Disease, drugs, all of those things. So nothing positive comes to mind. So it's a very loaded and judgmental term, and by constantly using it, we're constantly reinforcing this message, which is a really, really skewed narrative and representation of sex workers today. In the UK, research has shown that street sex work, so people selling sex on the street, accounts for only 15 to 20% of the whole industry. The rest is either online or indoors, and it's only of the people that work on the streets, that's where the very serious people with addiction tend to sort of, something like in Leeds, about 80% of people selling sex on the streets are addicted to drugs. So you can't pretend that person that you've just described isn't there. But that person needs to be treated with compassion and given a voice as well. But what sex worker rights groups are very concerned about is that person is coming to stand in for the entire experience of it. And it's all encapsulated in that word prostitute. And whereas journalists and activists and scholars in social science and psychology and are catching up and beginning to realize that using stigmatized words reinforces stigma, historians don't do that. We've kind of got this idea that because we're writing about somebody who's been dead for 200 years, that it's okay, that we don't have to use those words. And I've heard a lot of historians say that it's not historically accurate, so we don't like to use sex worker. It feels anachronistic. And whereas I can appreciate that, I think that we've managed to move past writing about civil rights without writing about, using the N word, things like that. So language changes and evolves.
There's an interesting debate going on now that I think is somewhat analogous to that, of whether to use the word slave, instead to use the term enslaved people, and rather than using the word slave holder or slave owner, instead using the word enslaver, so that the power imbalance between the enslaver and the enslaved person is always kept in mind while you're reading, and that it's not just like this sort of institution that is ahistorical, but rather requires constant enslaving.
Yeah.
And even to, there's a historian, Edward Baptist, who, instead of referring to them as plantations, in his book, The Half Has Never Been Told, he refers to them as labor camps. And there's been a lot of pushback against that from people making that very same criticism that it's anachronistic.
I mean, it's a really interesting debate to have, isn't it? Because you don't want to lose too much of the history of it. Because, like, for example, the word slave and the word prostitute, not that I want to, draw too many comparisons between those two things, but those words are historically valuable because that was how people were seen through that word. And if you take, for example, let's say Jack the Ripper, right? So if you're writing a history of Jack the Ripper, do you use the word prostitute to describe his victims? And you've got to concede that word has a lot of input to that history because the women were dismissed and judged and marginalized others as, quote, prostitutes. So it's important to the case, but as a contemporary historian, when you're writing in your contemporary voice, you don't have to use that word, or you can acknowledge the power implicit in it. Like, you don't have to title your book Prostitution in Victorian England, for example.
I see, yeah.
But it is an interesting debate because does it take something away from the history to call, for example, a plantation a labour camp? I mean, I can absolutely see why he would say that. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't how they viewed it at the time. But do you know what? I always defer to the people that we're writing about. So if the sex worker rights movements want me to not use the word prostitute when I'm writing about their history, that's what.
But the word whore doesn't have a similar. I'm interested in that then.
It has huge stigma, huge, right? Yeah. Absolutely, but the word whore, it's not absolutely related. It's not linked to a profession. It's linked to a perceived moral state. Right. Women get called whores all the time, whatever job they do. I think Randy Rhoads was fired for calling Hillary Clinton a big whore on the campaign trail. Marie Antoinette was called a whore. Joan of Arc was called a whore, and she died a virgin. Elizabeth I was called the English whore. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian whore. All of the things. So you don't have to be selling sex to be called a whore. It's a perceived moral state. And the original meaning of whore was not sex worker. It was somebody who was sexually immoral. But so I kind of use it. I use it in the project not only because it rhymes quite conveniently, but also because it's kind of like I want the project to be about illicit sex and sex that's judged, sex that has been thought of as whorish and bad and moralized over.
Well, so you've talked about positive feedback you've gotten from sex workers, which surprised you, apparently. Yep. What kind of feedback have you gotten from, colleagues, fellow PhDs? Has it been negative, positive, mixed, or?
It tends to be very positive. People enjoy it, and they enjoy the kind of they enjoy the feed. They enjoy the things that I write about, but more than anything, they enjoy that there's an opportunity to kind of listen to other people's voices. Occasionally, I get who do I get negative? Radical feminists. They don't like me very much. They get quite shy at me. Yeah, obvious because it's a very morally divisive issue, right? Sex work. There exists a very hardcore line of so-called radical feminists that are often termed sex work exclusionary radical feminists or SWERFs. And
it's sort of like trans exclusive.
You got it. Worse and TERFs. Yeah. Absolutely, you've got it. And they maintain the view that sex work is always exploitative. It's always an abusive situation. It must always be done out of desperation. It's always hideous. And so they get very angry with me because they think that I'm glamorizing sex work, or they I've been called all kinds of things, pimp enabler.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah. So yeah, I get it. They get upset with me quite a lot, but I don't really care very much about what they think.
Do you think that they're reacting to when you talk about how the street sex worker comes to stand in for all sex work, and it really is kind of more what we might think of as survival sex, or perhaps there does tend to be more kind of power imbalance with the pimp or something like that. That is coloring their perception of it.
Well, how do you know that sex work on the street is about survival sex?
I guess I'm just thinking, you were talking about how higher percentage of street sex workers tend to have
addiction
issues or mental health issues or something like that. That just anyone on the street, whether they're a sex worker or not,
is more, right?
Excuse me?
Is more vulnerable if they're
right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I guess that's a good point. That it's sort of a chicken or the egg thing. Is it because they're on the street that they end up having addiction?
The way that I look at it is, I do a lot of work with a local charity called Basis, who support extremely vulnerable sex workers across the industry, but they work a lot with street sex workers. So I've got very up close and personal, and obviously can't anonymity and those things, but there are so many reasons people end up in that situation, and I'm sure that they're not taking drugs because they're selling sex on the street. They're selling sex on the street because they're taking drugs. It's an addiction issue. These women are, if you took away the addiction in almost all the cases, then they would be able to rebuild. But what you're dealing with here is people with extremely complex needs, often mental health issues, often with very traumatic backgrounds. They're talking about extremely vulnerable people. And I don't think that criminalizing them and making it harder for them to come forward or speak out, or reinforcing the idea that they're doing something bad, helps anybody. I think that it plays into the hands of people that abuse them. If you create an atmosphere where people feel they have to be silent and that they can't speak up.
Is this correct that sex work in and of itself is not criminal in the UK, but solicit or go ahead.
It's criminalized at the moment. So the actual selling of sex is not illegal, but activities associated with it are. But in Leeds, where I live at the moment, they have, for the last year, they have been running a scheme in the so-called red light area of Leeds, in an area called Holbeck, where in very clearly defined parameters between the hours of 8 p.m. and 7 a.m., there are no police prosecutions for soliciting or for selling sex. But what there is an increased police CCTV, police cars patrol the area regularly. There's dedicated police liaison officers. Charities like Basis, another one's called Joanna House, have been able to go into the area and start up dialogues with the women selling sex on the streets. And the reason that they're doing that is because research came out from the University of York in 2010 that said that sex workers were not reporting violent crimes. They weren't. They were being beaten up, they were being hurt, they were being abused, but they weren't going to the police because they were already criminalized. So in an effort, because why would you? If you're already doing something that's illegal, why would you go to the? So they had this. So sex workers were not speaking to the police. So they brought in what's called the managed area, because they're trying to encourage police and the sex workers to be able to talk to one another. And it's received a lot of stigma and a lot of attack in the press. And there's been this awful BBC documentary that's been filmed there that's been hugely exploitative. But even despite all of that, it's worked really well, because the women are now reporting crimes to the police. They're reporting them 4 times more often than they were before, and there's been numerous police prosecutions. So I hear all the arguments that some people in the sex industry are exploited and are vulnerable and are hurt. Absolutely. But I'd like to draw a very clear distinction between somebody who's trafficked and forced and abused because they're a victim of rape. They're not a sex worker. They're a victim of hideous, grotesque abuse.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't think that by criminalizing and creating an atmosphere of silence that we actually save or help anybody. So that's my very considered stance on the subject.
Yeah, it's almost like you don't see, there are no issues involving the exploitation of sex workers that decriminalization wouldn't solve.
Well, yeah, that's the way I look at it, and believe me, I've researched this thoroughly. I've listened to all the debates and to everything, but it's by making it illegal, you force it underground, you make people more vulnerable. And we can't let moral judgments about whatever your personal opinion is on people either buying or selling sex cloud that. It's safer when it's not criminalized, when people can view it as a profession. Like last year in Scotland, there was a sex worker who was murdered by a client. She met him in a flat, and instead of phoning the police, she phoned two of her friends, and he attacked her and he killed her. If that had been any other profession where you have to see a client, physiotherapist, psychotherapist, anything like that, like where you go and you meet somebody and that person starts to get violent, they would have phoned the police immediately, right? It wouldn't have occurred to them not to do it. But because she's a sex worker, she didn't feel that she was able to, and she was murdered. So, these are really big issues that we're dealing with here.
This is a somewhat different question, but something I was thinking about. It occurred to, how to put this, a particular kind of sex workers, like the dominatrix. And I started wondering if Britain has not had a kind of outsized influence globally when it comes to kink. It's kind of an export almost, if you think about it, not only in the West and Japan, of how much that what people in the world find kinky and sexy has to do with these just kind of stuff, they're pretty specific to British society and culture.
I'd never thought of that question before. I mean, I know that sort of like flagellation and BDSM was known as the English vice in the 19th century, so we was certainly famous for that. But yeah.
I know that, spanking children is something that is kind of particularly British. And I wonder if that, I don't, I don't know enough about that. But so I might not be right about that. I think I just heard that somewhere. But
possible. But as far as I can see, sort of a much bigger exporter of stylized sexuality would be France, because that was where most of the erotic photographers and the first pornographers started, was in Paris, and they exported a great deal of their images over here. They were known as postcards from Paris. But how much of that they picked up from the Brits, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah,
but
I wonder.
These are the Marquis de Sade.
That's true. I guess neither the S or the M in BDSM is named after a Brit. I would be interested. I'd be interested in reading a history of that looked at. It was kind of like a trans-imperial look at how stuff spreads.
God, it'd be very. But they've found sort of etchings on the walls of Pompeii and in various tombs in the ancient world of people whipping each other and being particularly kinky. So maybe it's just something, and it must just be something innate within human beings.
Something about pain, and I suppose, yeah.
Because you don't get wildebeest on the Serengeti, asking each other if they could go in for a spanking session.
Right.
It must be a uniquely human thing, right?
Oh, I'm sure there's probably some pop science article about
them
baboons,
right.
like who knows? Anyway.
If anybody knows the BDSM sex life of the chimpanzee, let us know immediately.
Yeah, leave it in the comment section.
Yes, please.
You do have a project you're working on, a Curious History of Sex. Are you still crowdfunding that, or have you finished?
It's very, very, very close. It's closing in on 95% funded at the
Okay.
moment. That's pretty exciting, and I'm splitting the profits with Basis Sex Work, the people that I mentioned. So I'm very pleased that it's not just keeping me in stockings and gin, but it could actually do some good as well and help some people.
Is BASIS an acronym, or?
No, it's not. It's just Basis Yorkshire. It's just kind of like to touch base. That's kind
I
of
see.
Yeah.
And I mean, what do you have envisioned for this book?
Oh, it's a very good question. I've been writing sort of like for the site and sort of my own little articles and bits and pieces. So I'm taking those and I'm sort of expanding them and I'm adding new ones to it. And I've been asking people, because it's crowdfunded, everyone's got an opportunity to feed back to me, asking about, well, what would you like? Would you like to see more articles about this, that, and the other? And people said that we want more about trans history and more about LGBTQ history, so that's fine. So I have a section for that as well. And I'm just, cause I was trying to think, how do I draw it all together in a theme? And I guess that the theme just is sex. The theme is, look at all the stuff that people have been doing to one another to have an orgasm. It just seemed we've so overthought the entire process and the stuff that we come up with. And it's about the stuff that we've eaten, or that we ritual stuff, or things that we've put into one another, or put on, or dressed up, or all of these things that we've built up around sex. Because the actual mechanics of sex has changed very little since we first started doing it. The end result is usually the same. But we've got all of these elaborate rituals that go around it, and fears and superstitions. So I'm dividing it up into chapters where it's sex and. So I have sex and food, sex and penises, sex and vaginas, sex and breasts, sex and, I thought I might do sex and bottoms as well. Do sex and words, and sex and money. And I think there was a few others as well. Oh, and a word of the day, obviously. A word of the day index.
Right.
Possibly the historical hotties. Yeah.
If you don't follow the Whores of Yore Twitter account, you have a word of the day every day. It's some sort of sexual term.
Yes, it's past historical sexual slang.
Mm-hmm.
Not always sexual. Sometimes it's just something that made me laugh, or it might be something about drinking, or something like that, depending on my mood. But yeah, normally it's kind of like, it's like a past historical sexual dictionary. Yeah. So I kind of trawl various things to find things that make me laugh.
And what's the site? Is it Unbound? Is that what it is? Because it's not Kickstarter, right?
No. It's they're part of Penguin and Random House, but they use a crowdfunded model. Oh. So it's a way. Yeah. So I keep having to explain that to people, especially my parents, about like, it is an actual book.
Well, I would encourage people to seek that out and contribute to it while you still can.
Yeah, please.
And if you come to it too late, then just buy it when it comes out.
Yeah, right. But you won't get special treats. I give little bits and pieces away to people that are pledging to it.
Yeah. So you want to take advantage of that. I know. Yeah. So there's one little an article that you wrote for the site that I guess might end up in the book. We talk about vibrators, and it got me thinking, because you're talking about this book that I read, impressionable youngster, called the Technology of Hysteria by Rachel Maines, and she posits that there was a time when women who were being diagnosed with hysteria would go to the doctor, and doctors were, digitally manipulating them to bring them about to paroxysms, which means interpreted as orgasms.
Yes.
and that the vibrating machines came about as a way to save doctors the inconvenience of having to do this.
Yes.
And this even ended up in I don't know how well the movie did, but that movie Hysteria.
Yep. And there's another one called the Belleville, wasn't there? And that was a similar thing.
But apparently, she got a lot wrong.
Yeah, she did. I mean, I don't want to take too much away from this because it's one of those myths that we all love. We love this one, and there are flashes of truth in it. But Rachel Maines says all the way through it, it's a hypothesis, it's a theory. So it's and the history of sex wasn't her specialty. I think that actually her PhD was on the history of fabric design. So she's kind of done a bit of a lurch over to that one. But it's got flashes of truth in it, like this mysterious disease hysteria that no one's ever quite able to define. That certainly was present for a long time. And it was linked to, well, it means womb. Hysteria means womb. So it was linked to wombs and to sexuality. It's definitely a hefty dose of it. But the smoking gun in that theory is that we need to find a doctor who invented a vibrator to masturbate a female patient to orgasm to cure hysteria. And I've never been able to find any examples of that at all. Now, there are, there's womb manipulation that goes on. There, you can read a few crazy, German mostly, pamphlets about womb manipulation. And mostly what that involves is pressing on the abdomen in various strange ways where the womb is. There are some pictures using digital penetration with the fingers to manipulate the womb. But crucially, there's no orgasm involved and there's no vibrator.
It's almost like moving a baby around.
Yeah, you've got it. It's a weird gynecological thing that they were doing. So, you know, that's weird enough in itself. We don't need to get a vibrator in there as well to make it weirder. But the Victorians were very suspicious about orgasms. You know, they weren't, I was going to say they weren't keen, but everyone's keen on orgasms. Orgasms are great. But what they were worried about was that it depleted energy levels, especially in men. And you have this belief that starts to rise up that if you waste your semen, if you'll deplete your energy levels and you'll kind of wither up and you'll die horribly. You see that in a lot of medical texts.
Neurasthenia.
Yes.
Yeah.
Onanism and spermatozoa, that I can never quite pronounce. All these weird illnesses. So they were actually quite worried about masturbation and about orgasms. They're not a group of people likely to prescribe an orgasm. And the other thing is they knew what an orgasm was. They didn't need to wrap it up in this, it's a hysterical paroxysm. They knew what an orgasm was. If you have a look through any Victorian pornography, they know what an orgasm is. Absolutely, they do. So I hope that I'm wrong. I really want Maines to be right because it's such a fun theory. But I've never found reference to a vibrator that's been invented to make a woman orgasm. And if you've looked at the early vibrators, they're not something that you'd want to put anywhere near your genitals. They're really they're kind of like pneumatic drills almost. It's just no.
I'd be interested. I know there's a book just came out, Hallie Lieberman.
Yes, I've heard about this.
Called Buzz, I think.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see what she has to say about it.
I haven't had the privilege of reading it yet, but I've heard very
I think it just came out.
Yeah, it's just come out, hasn't it? As far as I know, I think that she does discuss this, and I think that she's kind of also definitely in agreement that it didn't happen. But she talks that she's linking the invention of the sex toy with the liberation of women as well, in like post 1950s America. So that's a really interesting idea, and I'll be really excited to read that one.
Maybe we'll invite her on here.
Do it, absolutely, and tell her I say hi. Yes.
All right. What was I going to ask? Well, here's something I want. I just read this headline. I don't know how true it is, but saying that American teens have, maybe I should pull up the, but just that in a certain span of time. Oh, here it is. This is the Daily Mail. From 1990, 1 in 10 young people had engaged in anal sex, and now it's 1 in 5. And I remember, I want to say, I don't know if you're familiar with Andrew Sullivan, he's been on Blogging Heads before. He had the big blog, the Dish. He's just kind of a political and social commentator. But anyway, he's from Britain. But he theorized that that increasing acceptance of LGBTQ people was actually leading more straight people to have anal sex. I don't know.
What a load of shit.
But
along with earthquakes and all the rest of it. No. Utter tosh. No. God, that's such a weird thing to say. No, I
don't
think
get a problem with it. I think you just. But
okay, that's maybe he saw some gay people talking and thought, now I really want to try anal sex, and just assumed that others were the same. I don't know.
Well, he's gay, but
Oh, okay.
Anyway.
I think I would suggest that really what's happened more is it's not the fact that we're more comfortable around LGBT people, but it's more that porn is so widespread, and there is a huge prevalence of anal sex in pornography, and almost all young people have access or have seen pornography at some point. And so what they see in pornography is becoming their normal. That's becoming what they think is normal. So they see anal sex happening in porn, and that's something that they want to try. I would suggest that is far more likely, along with the disappearance of pubic hair and young people reporting more and more violence during sex and sort of like, I think that porn has a lot to answer for. And don't get me wrong, I love porn, obviously, I study it, but we need to create a space around this almost just singular narrative that's quite a violent narrative in porn that we have, where it's, if you're watching heterosexual porn, it tends to be woman on knees, woman chokes on enormous penis, woman cries, woman bent over, lots of sex, she doesn't come, or if she does, it's this hugely violent squirting fountain affair, and then yay, because that happens, and then he flips her over and comes all over her face. It's like there's very little deviation from that particular script, and there's nothing wrong with enjoying that kind of sex and enjoying watching it, but the problem is that we have so little alternative to it. That's become the narrative. That's become the dominant narrative. And I look at that and I think, well, where's her orgasm? Does she really enjoy? Like, it doesn't look like she's enjoying that too much. It's all about kind of submission and about domination. And when young people see that, and we're not talking to our kids about porn, that becomes their normal. That stands in for normal.
I wonder, we hear people thinking about how much, like the 2016 election in the U.S., how much the narrative was shaped by men who we have since learned, were these just serial sexual harassers and sexual assault, and how much that shaped political narratives. And now I think about the thing that, was it last year, with the accusations against James Dean, the American porn star, of rape and sexual assault, and I.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, I think. I'm with you. Stoya tweeted out what he did to her, and then I think a couple other people. Anyway, I wonder if that's something that needs to be talked about more, sexual harassment and assault within the porn industry. which
Definitely.
is something that many people wouldn't recognize as happening.
Definitely. Absolutely.
And how much that's part of the narratives that are, being produced over and over again. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be an interesting thing. I mean, I think that would be that'd be a very worthwhile thing to find and do some research into. But I think as far as pornography goes, the genie is officially out of the bottle. I don't think that no amount of censorship is going to get it back in now. That's it. But what we absolutely have to do, is we have to speak to our kids about it, which I know is a hideously uncomfortable conversation for so many people. But if you're not talking to your kids about sex, porn is. And if you're not getting in there first to say, you might not have a 12-inch penis, or to say, it's okay if you don't want to have anal sex on a first date with him and his flatmate. Those kind of things, is we have to get in there and we have to talk about porn and explain what it is. It's not just sexy images of people having sex. It's an artificial thing. People don't, even the people having sex on film don't actually have sex like that. It's all heavily stylized, heavily shot, heavily scripted and produced and edited and all those things. But it is, especially in Britain, and I guess in America as well, is we do not like having those conversations. So the prevalence of pornography is more and more shaping what younger people think of as sex.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, there's definitely moral panic over, porn addiction, and it has more to do with just the quantity of porn rather than the narratives that they're getting from it.
Definitely. I mean, when I was a young person, is if you wanted porn, you had to buy a magazine of it, which you didn't do, or you'd find a stash of it in a bush somewhere that nobody quite knew. I don't know if you had that in America, but in Britain, just had loads of. It's called
the local porn bush. I don't know if we.
The local porn bush. I don't know who was leaving porn in bushes, but it seems to have happened across Britain. That might be my next research project. But if that was where you had to go if you wanted to see porn, and if you look at those images now, and obviously I post a lot of them and I research them, is you just look at them and they're so tame. They almost look cute. They almost look like, oh. But at the time, people were so angry and so worried and upset about it. And it just kind of shows you how far and how violent and aggressive that porn has become now. When you look, especially when you look at sort of Victorian images of pornography, before those very stylized shots, because now porn has become incredibly stylized, and we all know how you're supposed to look in a photograph. We've got selfies. Everybody does the selfie pouch and all those things. But in the 19th century, photography was so new that when you're looking at the images, you get a real sense that they don't know what looks sexy yet. They're trying to work it out. You've got weird ones with taxidermy in, or just strange props that somebody's bought in, as if they're going, does this look sexy? Does this work? But the thing that I like about a lot of Victorian pornography is the people look like they're having a really good time.
Yeah, people smile. Yeah, you don't see people smile in porn today.
Yeah, they smile, they're laughing, they've got little pot bellies, they've got pubic hair, armpit hair. They actually look like there's a lot of them looks like some affection there. And it's such an unusual thing to see that's one of the biggest comments that I get fed back on Twitter, is that they haven't seen bodies that look like that before. Which is a weird thing to say, because your body looks like that.
Yeah, so they're saying I haven't seen a body like mine before.
Quite exactly what they're saying. And not just that, but a body that looks like theirs but looks beautiful. It's an attractive body to look at that looks like theirs, and it's fuzzy and it's a bit wibbly, but it's a lovely image and it's a nice thing to look at. And it's strange, but these images that people were once so worried were degrading and humiliating now actually serve a purpose of almost reaffirming people. I've had so many messages about people saying that they felt better about themselves after looking at a body like theirs in an erotic image. And that's strange where that's gone. But yeah.
Yeah. Do you see that happening? When do you see that shift happening? Does it happen with the internet? Does it happen earlier in the
The internet plays a big part in it, right? And we're such a visual culture now. Is like visual, like photographs and images everywhere. Everyone's got their phone with them all the time, and you have access to billions of images, and so we receive so much more messages about what a normal body, normal inverted commas, or a sexy body looks like. So you're competing against something that wasn't there 100 years ago. I mean, people had paintings and magazines and newspapers and those kind of books and things like that, but not like it is now. So the image saturation, the rise of photography, the rise of film, definitely the rise of internet has all served to create images of what a normal body is supposed to look like. I mean, I say this like, it's not some Victorian utopia. I mean, they were crushing their waists in corsets to 18 inches. But, yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah.
But I always think that it's very interesting that people, especially women, react very positively to Victorian erotic images because they've not seen bodies like that in erotic images. Yeah. Who knew?
I think one of my favorite things that you do on your account is the historical hotties, where often people send in pictures of like their grandparents or their aunt or
Oh, it's so lovely. It's so lovely. I mean, one of the things that was pointed out pretty early on was that almost all the images are of women. And that's true, I suppose, is gay pornography from the 1800s is much harder to find. And sort of images, there are just more images of naked women, like there are now more images, male gaze and all that lot. But it was pointed out that this, and I was thinking, that's right. So every day I started to do this thing called #historicalhottie, which was to just post an image of a photograph, some old daguerreotype or something, of a guy that was attractive. Doesn't have to be famous, just a historical hottie, just to try and even up the eye candy that was on offer. It wasn't long before people started sending me their grandpa or their great uncle, or it was really heartfelt stuff. It was so lovely that people do that. I'm really touched every single time. Luckily, nobody has submitted anyone that isn't hot, because I don't know what I'm going to do with that. when I have to give it back and go, well, sorry. But no. So I love it when people do that, and they give me a little story that goes with it as well. That's a really, really nice one.
Well, I remember now that there's a law that has either been recently passed in the UK or is being debated that
this is the
affect your website or
this is the UK censorship law that's coming in next year. It's very ill-defined at the moment, so no one really knows what they're up against. But they're going to bring in a law in the UK where you can't access adult content online without proving that you're over 18. So when you first hear that, you might think, well, that sounds like a good idea, because we can all agree that kids shouldn't be looking at hardcore pornography, right? I think that we could all say that is a bad idea. So anything that we could do to stop that is a good idea. But
sorry to interrupt. So in the UK, if you go to like a porn site, there isn't like a thing where you have to click yes, I'm 18.
Oh yeah, you have to click that, but no one in the history of the universe has ever honestly answered that and said, no, I'm not, I better go to bed.
Okay, so this would be a more rigorous...
Yeah, enter your credit card details, prove you're over 18.
Oh.
That's what this would be. But no one's quite sure if it's going to be entering your credit card details yet. No one's quite sure who's going to be judging what is and what isn't pornographic. So, for example, will Whores of Yore be caught in the crossfire because there are historical images of sex on the site? What about sex workers who advertise their business online? Is that an adult content that will be caught up in this? And no one can tell you either. Is like, well, what are we supposed to do? Do I have to buy software that so I can collect people's credit card details, and then what do I do with that when I've got it? And so it's very, very poorly defined, and no one is quite sure yet what's going to happen.
And I would think it would be a shame if, a teenager who, is curious about sexuality and about history and about sex work, I would think it'd be a shame if they weren't allowed to access your website.
Right? Yeah, I do too. And not just my website, but like a sex education site's going to be caught up in this. Is that all right for them to see these things as well? And the really big important thing is it won't work. It won't work. Any tech savvy teenager knows how to circumnavigate these things. And if they don't, they can nick a credit card off their parents. I mean, my God, my niece is 5 years old and she can do stuff on my phone that I didn't even know my phone could do. The idea that a horny teenager is going to go, oh, well, I best not do this then. So it's not going to work. And
it seems to be a workaround that avoids what you're suggesting, which is people actually talking to their kids.
Yeah, that's the one that I'm really worried about, is that it's part of this. Well, if we just keep repressing it, we just won't have to talk about it, and that's not it's not helpful. The reason that this has been brought in is because research was done by the NSPCC and some other children's safety charities, and it was done into children's online viewing habits of online pornography, and they found out that just over half had accessed online pornography, and on the basis of that's being used to justify rolling this in. But I read through that research, and one of the other things that the subjects, the children being interviewed, said is that more than anything, they want to learn about pornography from adults who will talk to them about it in a safe and respectful way. So they've ignored that bit completely and have just gone for this, oh my God, half of children have seen online pornography. Quick now, no adults at all can look at anything ever.
By age what? How did they define?
Well, I think it was up to 16 was this research. I think. So I know, like, you kind of listen to it going, well, who hadn't seen porn by the time they were 16? But I'm on board with educating kids about porn and about trying to stop some of the damaging influence that it's having. But I don't believe that by censoring it, firstly, it's not going to work. And I think that it gets you out of having a very necessary conversation with your children about pornography and about sex. And I'll be pissed off as well if my site gets kicked off. But there you go.
Yeah, I think we all would be.
Well, I can, if they don't want the images there, I can take the images down. I mean, it's not really about... But it would be a shame, right? Because there's an archive on there that a French archivist, Alexandre Dupont, he has a huge collection of images of sex workers and brothels in 1930s Paris. And he's been so kind and generous, and he's allowed me to put some of them on the site in an archive. And they're just the most amazing snapshot into history and into this very little spoken about world. And if that wasn't there, you wouldn't even know that these things existed. So I don't view that as pornography. I mean, you wouldn't know that these women were messing around in a brothel with tights and hats and having a laugh with one another. But we've got pictures of it, and it's an amazing thing. I think it'd be a shame if we lost things like that. Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to talk about, or?
I don't think so. Only that if anybody would like to write for the site, I'm always after articles. So if anybody has, and not just historians, although absolutely historians write me things, tell me things, but anyone who has a perspective on any aspect of sex whatsoever, just get in touch. You can email me through the site, and all perspectives and thoughts are welcome. Yeah.
All right, great. Well, and if someone, your Twitter handle, well, I guess you have two Twitter handles, really. I mean, there's the Whores of Yore, at Whores of Yore, right?
Yep.
Handle. And what's your other handle? Or
it's at Literature Peep, I think.
Right.
That's...
People want to follow you.
If they want to.
Yeah. And I tweet at Wiliam R. Black. And thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. Thank you for coming on.
No problem.
All right.